On the afternoon of February 12, 1945, at precisely 4:47, a 22-year-old American infantryman pressed his coat into the frozen loam of the hills west of Ardennes. His name was Jack "Red" Bighgam, a quiet Kansan serving as a sniper with the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, under the 4th Infantry Division. Cold air carried a bitter blend of pine resin and burned propellant. Cradled in his gloved hands lay a Springfield M1903A4, the rifle issued to American marksmen, but the glass on top was nothing anyone had been taught to trust. The optic wasn't regulation. It wasn't even military. Jack had cobbled it together himself, a strange hybrid born of scavenged parts and stubborn patience. For readers drawn to such untold accounts of innovation under fire, you can subscribe to WW2 Hidden Archives to uncover more real stories from the front lines. At first glance, it appeared ridiculous, a contraption fastened with improvised rings, hand-scratched dials, and a tube of glass that had no business on a battlefield. His squad mates smirked, cracked jokes, and shook their heads. Toys don't survive real war, they said. Men who play inventor get other men killed. Then, less than half a minute later, a German tank more than 200 yards away blazed into sudden fire, a crimson pillar clawing at the gray winter sky, and the laughter stopped as if someone had snapped a wire inside the valley's echo. What happened in those seconds became a legend whispered in mess lines and foxholes. One man, one shot, one scope that should never have worked. It is the unlikely story of Jack "Red" Bighgam, the soldier they teased for tinkering until the instant he turned doubt into flame and chaos. It is also a story about ingenuity that refuses to wait for permission, about persistence practiced in darkness, and about the razor-thin difference between impossible and done. People think breakthroughs arrive in laboratories or factories stamped with serial numbers. Often they start in damp earth with numb fingers and a stubborn mind that refuses to accept standard issue as the final word. Jack's rifle lacked polish, but it had purpose, and that was enough. On that cold hillside, the hierarchy of innovation flipped upside down. The blueprint was mud. The test range, a windy French clearing. The patent office, a quiet man's notebook smudged with grease and graphite. And the proof was a fireball that rolled over the treetops. To reach that morning in Ardennes, go back to the snows of the Ardennes. During the winter of 1944, the German counteroffensive battered the American lines, and the 4th Infantry Division clawed forward mile by grudging mile. Men slept in holes bitten from ice and clay, their boots stiff as shovels by dawn. By early February 1945, the front drifted east into the Champagne-Ardenne region, where hills rose like sleeping beasts and the woods grew tight and dark. The 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry, often shortened to 2-3, drew orders to probe beyond a ridge of pines and thin chalk trails. The mission was simple only on paper: find where the enemy braced for a stand, weaken it without inviting disaster, and keep the pressure moving toward the Reich. Among the men assigned was Bighgam, a farm-town mechanic who spoke in gentle tones but handled tools with surgeon's certainty. He came from Marshall, Kansas, where wheat fields are straight lines and watches told truth because people like Jack demanded it of them. Before war swallowed his calendar, Jack fixed time for a living. At 19, he apprenticed in his uncle's watch shop, coaxing balance wheels and pinions into harmony. He adjusted spring tension with the same care a violin maker uses on a bridge. Older customers joked that his blood ran colder than the brass he polished. Those hands, steady, patient, unwilling to rush, surprised instructors at Fort Benning. During marksmanship drills, he learned faster than he was taught. He saw the world like a ruler sees a page. Wind hinted in trembles of grass. Range whispered in fence post spacing and the width of road ruts. Light told truths in the length of a shadow at mid-afternoon. Yet there was no formal sniper pipeline waiting for him, and optics were scarce. Many scopes had cracked, fogged, or vanished between depots. The Weaver 330C and other models were spoken of like rare birds. Scrounging was a skill. Waiting for resupply was a risk. In 2-3, there were 3 scopes for the battalion. Men fought with what they had. Jack chose to make more than that. He asked for nothing official, only time and quiet. At the battalion aid station, he found a wounded treasure. A busted American-made microscope, a Bausch and Lum unit fractured by transport. The precision glass hadn't lost its soul. He salvaged the lens tube, cleaned grit from the optics, and shaved metal until the weight balanced. From a gutted German 88mm shell fuse, he lifted a steel ring stout enough to become a mount. Over 2 sleepless nights, he soldered, filed, and trued the parts so they married the Springfield's receiver without crushing the wood. He built adjustment marks with pencil cuts and a pocket knife, then coated them with wax so cold fingers could feel the settings in darkness. When he showed the thing to his squad, hilarity filled the tent. The contraption looked like a science class glued onto a rifle. The platoon sergeant shrugged as if brushing away a gnat. Not in the manual, not to be trusted. If it snapped on the first shot, Jack could keep the pieces as a memento. Jack only nodded and went back to work. He tested where the pines thinned and a hump of iron-rich earth-stained gloves rust red. Helmets scavenged from scrap piles became targets on fence posts. He stepped back night by night, first 200 yards, then 4, then 6, then 8. He measured air like a carpenter measures beams, tallying drift and drop against the notches he'd carved. The glass ran cool blue and bruised by scratches that weren't there the day before. The zero slid a whisper when the temperature fell and crept back when the day warmed, so he marked those moods too. When frost fogged the eye lens, he rubbed on a film of soap and polished it dry. The fog learned to stay away. He spoke little to anyone, only to his ledger where tables grew like tight-laced fences. When the sergeant grumbled about stray rounds, Jack promised to bring his brass back in his pockets and his mistakes back in his notes. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing reliability. By February 10th, intelligence murmured the same name again and again, Panzerkampfwagen, the workhorse of German armor, and in that sector most often the Ausführung H, a brutish silhouette with a long 75mm gun and thickened plates on the front. For infantry trapped in the open, a Panzer or 4 turned men into statistics. The usual answers were air, artillery, or guts enough to creep close with a rocket. A rifle alone couldn't threaten armor. That was doctrine, and doctrine wasn't wrong. But Jack had read photographs with the same care he once read watch mechanisms. He studied the rear decks where vents chewed air, where fuel intake caps waited near warm engines, where hasty refueling turned dribbles into danger. He had watched columns grind through villages with spare jerry cans strapped on like luggage. He wasn't trying to crack steel. He wanted to light a match where gasoline had already spilled. A tank need not be killed to be beaten. Make it stop and everything behind it stutters. Scouts found a narrow track through the woods, muddy and invisible from above, perfect for moving armor in pieces. Reports counted at least 3 Panzers tucked into the timber, rotating like watch hands on a schedule no one advertised. The division ordered 2-3 to harry, to confuse, to be a wedge, and to seize the heights that would matter when spring turned the ground to roads. During the briefing that followed, Lieutenant Colonel Harris, a man with a voice of gravel and a gaze that did not blink easily, asked for a single shooter to be in place before sun brushed the ridge. Quiet, steady, cruel to distraction. Jack's name rose like smoke. In the command tent, Harris stared at the homemade glass perched on the Springfield and then at the man who believed in it. "Heard you decided to build your own truth, son," he said dryly. "Can it see farther than 400? Jack's answer wasn't a boast. Only a fact. Yes. Harris circled a spot on the map, grid 17 Alpha, a patch of higher ground hidden by pines roughly 1,200 yards from the likely refueling point. Go. No cavalry. No second shot if you get greedy. He packed like a man, granting himself no illusions. The Springfield and its strange glass. 40 rounds of carefully chosen 30-06. A small tool roll, wire cutters, 2 canteens, a single chocolate bar wrapped as if it mattered, and no sidearm. Weight was the enemy of the crawl. By nightfall he moved, the frost a glittering scrim over brittle grass. He cut fences and sealed them behind him with twisted wire so no track would advertise his path. Near midnight he reached the knoll, slid beneath a toppled pine and scratched a shallow scrape in the soil. Above him the moon threw thin light through high cloud, turning branches into splayed fingers drawn in silver charcoal. The noises of night were distant and rare, a far gun barking to the east, a long, sleepy thud of artillery somewhere behind the hills, a creak of wood arguing with cold. Time slowed. He checked the ring tension again and again, marked wind with tiny nicks on a branch, and ran his fingers over the elevation cutouts as if reciting a prayer he'd written for himself. The wait lasted hours. Just before morning softened the tree line. Smoke uncoiled along the horizon, then a blunt shape shouldered out of the dark. The tank eased to a halt just beyond the ridge, its exhaust breathing white into the blue air. Crewmen appeared like ghosts from hatches, one bareheaded, rushed by routine, tugging a jerry can from brackets at the stern. The moment Jack had rehearsed had arrived, not willing to wait. The window was tiny. Gravity and wind were not friends at this distance, only laws. He settled his cheek on the stock until wood and bone felt married. The reticle, handmade with a telephone wire hair stretched across a ring of dental cement, drew across no thicker than truth. He calculated drift, felt breeze on his nose like a cool hand, and judged it at perhaps 3 miles per hour, sliding from the west. Hold a little left, elevation as the tables demanded. Double-check nothing, breathe, empty lungs. Commit. Beyond him, the Panzer IV-H idled, its barrel lowered and idle roughness shuddering through the hull. A loader wrestled the can toward the fuel neck at the rear deck, head down, attention narrowed to caps and threads. The men believed distance made them untouchable. A kilometer of air tends to lie to you when you've lived this long. Jack didn't argue with distance. He had measured it and signed the arithmetic with his name. He was not trying to dent a turret. Rifle rounds are humble against armor, but a spark near an open cap above a hot engine? A tiny failure has larger friends. He leaned into the trigger until movement ceased to be motion and became inevitability. The recoil pushed the stock back into his shoulder like a firm handshake. The bullet streaked away, a dull, invisible line writing itself through fog. Time of flight measured in a single reconsideration of fear. He held the sight picture through the shot because flinching wastes wisdom. At that range, you learn to wait long enough to doubt. Then the jerrycan jumped like it had been slapped by an angry god. Liquid atomized into mist, and the mist became orange light as it found heat. Fire climbed, then ran, then leaped, greedy as a wild thing. A second breath later, the rear of the tank roared, and a low boom rolled across the valley like a drumbeat. The loader screamed without noise, legs already moving, arms flailing for purchase on steel that had decided to betray him. Another crewman tumbled from a hatch and dropped hard, the side armor flashing brighter as flame found paint. For a heartbeat, the Panzer tried to stay a tank. It failed, stalling in a bouquet of black smoke that rose past the pines in oily rings. The valley hesitated, caught between disbelief and recognition. There had been no spotting round, no whistling prelude from the sky, only a single shot that rewrote everyone's understanding of what mattered at 200 yards. Confusion is a weapon. The second German tank, surprised and suddenly aware of its own fragility, pivoted clumsily, showing flank where it should have shown teeth. Engines revved, orders barked, and for a few sacred seconds nobody on that side knew who was in charge. American mortars from the rear sought the sound like hounds called to dinner. Shells found dirt and then metal. The tree line spat rifles into the chorus. Jack worked his bolt once and then didn't fire again. Greed was for men who wanted credit more than results. He watched, memorizing the rhythms, looking for patterns that would save other people later. When he finally backed out, an hour older and a decade heavier, he reclaimed the path he'd carved in, now noisier behind him as his own unit moved to touch the chaos. Down in the company area, men didn't crack jokes this time. Someone clapped his helmet without meeting his eye. A soldier's way of admitting surprise and respect in the same gesture. That homemade scope had quirks you could hate if you were the kind of person who needed polished edges to feel safe. The image leaned bluish like dusk had rubbed itself across the glass. The objective didn't love cold. The zero moved with temperature like an old man's knees. The wire crosshair could sing if the wind kissed the bell correctly. But Jack had mapped its weaknesses until they were mapped strengths. He treated the lens like a living partner, warmed it against his body when frost threatened to bite, cut elevation in quarter-turn increments learned by fingertip, and kept a spare strand of telephone wire in his kit in case the reticle snapped under recoil. He took notes like a student on scholarship. Over time, the improvised optic stopped being a gimmick. It became an instrument, and instruments don't care whether you laugh at them. What separates miracle from method is documentation. In the little ledger he carried, columns tallied holdovers at 5-degree temperatures, drift at measurable breezes, and drop at every 100-yard stretch between sanity and legend. He wrote down what he believed he knew, and then tried to prove himself wrong until the numbers refused to change. The men who had mocked the toy saw a tool instead. The Army did not approve it. No forms were filed, no ordnance officer wrote it up, but men in his squad whispered that maybe the toolbox we bring to war is bigger than the one someone hands us. After-action talk credited mortars and timing and luck. All fair. Somewhere at the bottom of the page, a single round and a hand-built scope stretched the window that made those other successes possible. You can't put that on a requisition. You can carry it forward in your habits. If you want the engineering heart of what happened, it isn't hard to name. A 3006. Projectile stepping out around 2,700 feet per second holds authority at distance when pushed by a careful barrel and a man who isn't in a hurry to be noticed. At roughly 1,200 yards, time of flight lets you blink once, think twice, and suffer doubt before sound catches up with the past. Wind at the muzzle becomes yards off the mark at the target if you pretend breeze is a rumor. Heat on metal blooms into weakness where fuel separates from liquid into cloud. Ignition doesn't always need sparks. Heat and friction will do if you give them a friend. None of this is magic. It is the physics of patience, arithmetic applied to nerves steadied by practice. The human part is the one that refuses to forget the human part. Breath control, follow through. The humility to take the one shot you can make instead of the second shot you wish you could brag about later. Word of the flaming Panzer traveled fast and grew teeth as stories do. Some said he shot through a vision slit and hit ammunition with sniper's luck. Others swore he struck a seam at a perfect angle that no one could measure. The truth was stranger and simpler. He aimed at a small, soft thing attached to a dangerous machine and let fire do what engineers dread. The crew lived. Some scrambled away, so blackened they looked like the ghosts of their own decisions. The tank did not fight again. In that tiny exchange, the math of the morning changed. Schedules broke. An advance slowed. Information moved up the chain with a note. Someone out there is reaching farther than the manuals say he can. In the quiet that followed, Jack cleaned his glass, oiled the bolt, and sharpened the pencil that would record what he had learned. He did not pin a medal to his own chest or demand a ceremony. He had work left to do and a ledger to update. In the days that followed, he refined the optic one more degree at a time. He shaved the dental cement reticle carrier until parallax behaved. He annealed the ring screws and retorqued them so they stole less bite from the receiver. He blackened the inside of the tube with soot to tame stray reflections. He added a thin leather cheek piece to repeat his weld every time. The scope still wasn't beautiful. It was consistent, and in a craft where consistency buys men home, that is beauty of a sterner kind. Other soldiers started to ask quiet questions. How many clicks for 8? What's your wind truth at 10 degrees Fahrenheit? How do you keep it from fogging? He told them exactly what he knew. He did not wrap knowledge in mystery. He wrapped it in method. The platoon stopped calling it a toy. They started calling it Jack's glass. War historians like to assign turning points and crowns. This moment belongs better to a library of small rebellions. Men who refuse to accept that the only solutions worth trusting must come stamped, shipped, and signed by authority. There are limits to improvisation. Foolish courage gets graves dug. But once in a while, the line between recklessness and responsible invention runs through a man with the maturity to test, retest, and document. Jack didn't rig a bomb or saw off safety devices. He built a lens, learned its language, and let it speak when everything aligned. In doing so, he reminded his unit of a basic wartime truth. Logistics set the table, but ingenuity decides whether the food reaches your mouth. The flames on that tank were less a miracle than a mirror held up to a certain kind of mindset, one that looks at a broken microscope and sees a way to bring distant danger into focus. By the time spring came and the roads went from iron to mud to iron again, the units pushing east had changed hands, sectors, and maps more times than anyone wanted to count. The exact coordinates of Jack's shot lived in memory more than in paperwork, but the lesson burned bright. Doctrine can be a fence or a spine. It holds you up until it holds you back. For every official program that trained a sniper with a stamped scope, a handful of self-taught men learned to read wind like poetry and write history with a single round. Jack read Bighgam didn't argue with orders. He fulfilled them with a tool he made because no one else could spare him one. When the smoke cleared and the valley remembered how to be a valley again, he walked away with the same quiet gait he'd carried in, a little more tired and a little more trusted. No one wrote a manual chapter about a microscope scope mounted with a ring from an 88 fuse. No quartermaster built crates of them. The war had other priorities and better manufacturers. But on a specific cold morning in a particular French wood, that lens made all the difference between a tank that kept moving and a tank that became a bonfire. A single rifle in the right hands lengthened the reach of an entire battalion by exactly one problem solved at the right moment. That is how wars shift. Not only with grand offensives and famous speeches, but with tiny acts of precision made by people who can't bear to leave a solvable problem unsolved. Jack's story survives because it feels both outrageous and obvious. Of course it shouldn't have worked. Of course it did. Both statements can be true when preparation collides with opportunity at the distance where most men decide it is safer to let someone else be brave. If you listen closely, you can still hear the lesson breathing in the spaces between those trees. It says that doubt is the tax you pay on ambition. It says that innovation is the quiet sibling of courage, walking in step so closely that from a distance you might mistake them for one person. It says that the world has always been moved forward by hands willing to try, fail, measure, and try again in the dark. And it says, finally, that a kid from a small town who learned to fix time could, when forced by history, bend it a little, long enough for a bullet to travel 3/4 of a mile and find the one soft spot that would make a monster stop breathing. The sound of the rifle cracked across the hollow like a snapped whip, and for a breath the valley held its air. Then consequence arrived. A pinprick of light kissed metal, a snake of vapor hissed, an orange fire unfolded like a fast-growing flower. The fuel can burst first, spattering the crew with burning liquid that clung to cloth and skin. One man shrieked. Another stumbled into motion, arms flailing. Fire climbed the rear plates, found the engine grill, and crawled inward, greedy and sure. A moment later, the tank's stored rounds heated past safety, and the Panzer spoke with a muffled thunder, as if lightning had been trapped in a drum. The back end tore outward in a brutal exhale, a fireball punching up through pine-scratched air so hot it seemed to peel the sky. Smoke rose in heavy coils. Heat shimmered over frost like a hallucination, and the quiet that followed had weight. Bighgam didn't twitch. His trigger finger eased away from steel, and he watched the black column bloom and tilt as wind took it east. Down below, German infantry barked questions and scattered for hollows and logs. Some pointed, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Others flattened themselves into the cold soil, searching for a shooter they could not find. The shot had been too far, too clean. On the American ridge, men of 2-3 looked at one another with the stunned faces of witnesses to a magic trick whose secret refuses to show itself. They had heard a single report. Then came sudden flame, and then a violent detonation that wrote a new sentence across the morning. For an instant nobody spoke. Then a corporal breathed almost to himself that there was no way this had been Jack. A reply drifted back. He's alone out there. Hours later, Jack slid out of the tree line like a shadow, finally choosing to own a body. The cold had chewed his hands raw. Dry dirt freckled his cheekbones. He carried exhaustion like extra weight on his shoulders. When he reached the forward post, the grins and wisecracks that had followed him for weeks were gone. Men studied the rifle, then the unlovely scope bolted to it, then the quiet face behind both. No salute, no fanfare, only a hush you could feel. A man with a rifle nobody trusted and glass no one believed in had just proven something stubborn and simple about preparation and nerve. Jack said nothing. He didn't need to. The smoke on the horizon was his signature, and the silence in camp was the first line of a different reputation. The war grinding around them hadn't changed by afternoon, but the air around Jack had. The teasing names died: Scope Boy, Optics Jack, Professor. He walked through the bivouac like a man whose shadow had grown larger, not because he asked for reverence, but because results carry their own gravity. By evening, the story outran Boots. Division picked up a signal note. German radio traffic acknowledged a suspected sniper strike on an armored element. The Panzer that erupted, serial unconfirmed, belonged to a quick reaction force meant to choke the 4th Infantry's push. It never reached the gate. One well-timed shot had bent a timetable, and that bend rippled outward in ways spreadsheets never predict. Fear writes policy. Within a day, German crews in the sector were told to move fuel cans off rear decks, to refuel under cover whenever possible, and to keep hatches sealed unless necessity forced them open. Gossip does not change techniques. Caution birthed from pain does. At 2-3's command shack, Jack sat before a table where notebooks lay open and coffee steamed. The officers wanted detail, not legend. How had he planned it? What corrections had he used? What was that strange optic now smudged with soot and frost? He set the rifle down gently and talked them through it. How a broken Bausch and Lumb microscope had become useful glass. How he inscribed his makeshift turrets with match marks and wax. How he painted a reticle by stretching a single strand of field phone wire and setting it into dental cement. Pencil scratched. No one interrupted. For the first time, people listened with the patience usually reserved for orders. Lieutenant Colonel Harris leaned forward, elbows on the table, and asked without ceremony if Jack could teach the method. Jack did not blink. Yes, sir. A week later, he wore the same jacket but a different assignment for a few days. Temporary duty with division training, tasked with showing a handful of selected riflemen how to make more from less. His lessons were straightforward and unforgiving. Improvise with caution and accuracy. Record everything. Trust your instincts only after they have earned that trust from data. A sergeant who once laughed loudest at Jack's experiment asked to loan the scope for a look. He held it to the light, frowned at its ugly lines, and handed it back with a grudging nod. It's homely, he said, but it does the job. Requests multiplied. A runner from another battalion trotted in with a note asking for a demonstration. A staff major from division arrived unannounced, hat in hand, and asked for a written outline. It seemed impossible to them that glass assembled from scraps and solder had accomplished what no standard rig had managed in that patch of France. Halt a tank not by smashing it, but by outthinking it. Jack didn't preen. He was not built for gloating. He kept to his habits, nightly checks, careful cleaning, fingertips reading steel for problems by touch. He understood better than anyone else in the area that instruments fail when pride replaces maintenance. He wasn't pursuing celebrity. He was chasing repeatability. The rifle, the scope, and the moment had been fused together by consequence, and though he never asked for praise, the Army's gaze, cool and appraising, began to linger. In the 1950s, he accepted. War dragged on. 3 months later, Europe exhaled. May 1945 carried surrender into every ruined street and quiet farm. The cities wore their wounds in brick and ash. Fields in Champagne, Normandy, and the Ardennes held iron wreckage like grim. Crops and memory sank into the mud where boots had churned it. Jack went home that summer to Kansas, where the sky is long and conversations are short. Marshall greeted him without fireworks. His parents had left his small bench untouched, tools in their same rows, broken watches frozen mid-tick, a notebook, open to a penciled line, 3 seconds drift at 500 yards. He did not share much when neighbors asked. He smiled, said he had done his share, and let the subject sit. The Springfield and its homemade optic came with him. He locked them away out of sight, the glass still scarred, the mount still braced with wire and care, and for years they rested. In the 1950s, he accepted an invitation to speak at a veterans gathering in a town hall that smelled of coffee and floor wax. He brought the rifle and the scope not as trophies, but as exhibits in a lesson about stubbornness and method. He described the shot, the months of setup behind it, the jeers, the flaws, the corrections, the quiet stubbornness required to keep adjusting when everyone else calls you foolish. He ended with a plain sentence that later appeared on a brass plaque beside his display in the regional museum. It wasn't about the scope. It was about believing I could make something better even if I believed it alone. The Army did not adopt his design. That's not how procurement works. But his story seeped into the informal speeches instructors give when manuals go quiet. In Korea and later in Vietnam, a few cadre would tell recruits about the Kansan who built his lens and blazed a tank, trimming the tail as storytellers do, but preserving the core. Thinking differently can shift the ground under bigger things. Late in the 1970s, a historian hunting for accounts of improvised wartime tools found Jack and sat with him for hours. The scope lived then in a flannel-lined case, the rifle oiled and patient. The historian's notes became a chapter in a slender book with the title Long on Accuracy and Short on Romance, Tools of Last Resort, Ingenuity in Combat. That same year, Jack donated both artifacts to the Kansas Military History Center. Today, they rest under glass beside a faded portrait of a young man with square jaw, steady eyes, and hands marked by grease. Visitors drift past. Most do not notice. Some halt, lean close, read the caption, and trace the gouges and pencil marks with their gaze until understanding arrives. This is not a statue's tale. It's the story of a quiet mechanic who wouldn't make peace with the word impossible and changed an outcome because of it. Jack never chased legacy. He left one anyway. Doctrine changes slowly, and sometimes it needs a nudge from a corporal with a notebook. In the months after the fireball, the story threaded through 4th Division reports and trickled into evaluation memos. Official manuals did not add his name, but implications are stubborn. First, leaders recognized that field-bred innovation had been undervalued. Jack built utility under fire from a dead microscope, a ring salvaged from an artillery fuse, and lines scratched with a knife. That lesson is older than armies. Scarcity can be an accelerator. Second, he exposed a tactical blind spot. Sniper training focused on officers, machine gun crews, and observers. Almost no one talked about influencing armor without heavy weapons. Jack demonstrated that at the right time and place, a rifleman could set conditions that break a vehicle by attacking what supports it, rather than what protects it. Reviews began to recommend that marksmen learn the soft underbelly of machines. A modest clause appeared in a late 1940s field manual. Personnel should identify and exploit exposed support elements of mechanized forces when conditions permit. There was no attribution. There was a fingerprint. The third implication was cultural. The United States had lagged the Soviets and Germans in sniper structure during the war, suffering inconsistent programs and variable optics, while adversaries scaled training in glass. Jack's ugly, effective tube forced a question more valuable than any prototype. What happens if we empower disciplined, documented innovation at the edge instead of waiting for top-down blessings? In the 1950s, investments in standardized optics and more formal marksman instruction gained weight. By Vietnam, snipers were no longer an afterthought trapped between tradition and supply. Rifles improved, glass sharpened, doctrine matured. Jack didn't build that engine, but he tightened a bolt that had rattled loose. Battlefield intelligence is more than collecting facts. It is noticing when the facts demand you change how you fight. Modern training still carries the echo. Soldiers learn to map the vulnerabilities of vehicles, to ask better questions under stress, to fabricate or adapt gear when logistics lags, and to document solutions so others can repeat them. Those aren't academic values. They come from a man in a cold French wood who refused to accept that standard issue meant only option. One shot, one piece of homemade glass, one quiet refusal to salute a limitation, and a ripple that spread through classrooms and ranges for decades. Precision is never just a tool. It is a habit of mind applied with care by someone who has earned their confidence with practice. History loves parades and big dates, but the spine of it is built from decisions made without trumpets. A single act, a hand-built fix, a moment of nerve married to preparation, can push a larger thing a few inches farther than it could move on its own. Jack never shouted, never wrote a memoir, never asked people to pronounce him brave. He preferred the comfort of work done well. Yet his story confronts our comfortable myths about courage and craft. The glitter you see in a victory often comes from grit you cannot see at all. Breakthroughs rarely ask permission. They arrive wearing the plain clothes of effort, data, and patience, and they look strange until they suddenly look obvious. We live now in a world soaked in precision. Our devices arrive sealed, calibrated, and exact until they aren't. The spirit that guided Jack is more relevant, not less. Problems still appear where no technician is coming this afternoon, where a part is scarce, where time is tighter than protocol. Somewhere a person is being told their approach appears odd, inefficient, even foolish. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes odd is the seed of better. The impulse to say, I will build this myself and prove it under conditions, is not rebellion for its own sake. It is a mature form of responsibility. If you have been told you're chasing a dead end, that your tool looks wrong, that nobody does it like that, perhaps those are not stop signs but reminders to test harder, measure cleaner, and keep going. What remains most instructive about Jack's day in the pines is not the explosion but the preparation. He measured wind with caution instead of hope. He wrote down what the lens did in cold, then confirmed it again when the temperature changed. He made friends with the defects of his gear until they were predictable. He fired one shot because that was the number the plan allowed. In a world where hurry poses as competence, that is an unfashionable discipline. And yet, it is the discipline that carries across domains: engineering, medicine, design, teaching, any place where lives or livelihoods depend on more than swagger. Think of the battlefield that shaped his choice. Mud, wire, fear, and machines. Conformity, there is a survival skill. And still, in that narrow space, a corporal broke with habit safely and with documentation. He did not violate orders. He honored their intent by meeting needs with what he had. The wider lesson is generous. Innovation is not a department. It is a behavior, teachable and checkable, that thrives where leaders make room for it and where practitioners hold themselves to standards higher than convenience. The smallest useful change, properly aimed, can travel farther than its size would suggest. So which piece of this speaks loudest to you? The jeers that turned to quiet when the results arrived? The way men who had teased him grew thoughtful? The small adjustments the enemy made out of pain? Or the private life afterward, a workshop, left waiting, a notebook line about drift, a rifle stored in a cabinet until someone asked for the story? Maybe it's the unasked question Jack's life keeps raising. What tool, process, or idea would you build if you stopped waiting for unto? Engraved invitation? Maybe your plan looks odd right now. Most good ones do at first. Tell us in the comments what gripped you most: the laughter, the hush after the shot, the unexpected reach of his example, or the thing you're building without permission that might deserve a chance. Share this story if it moved you. Somewhere, someone is holding a jury-rigged answer and wondering if it's worth trusting. Your belief in their work might be the nudge that turns their preparation into a result. Thank you for watching and for thinking hard about what's possible when craft meets courage and patience refuses to rush.